It's one of the biggest royal events of our time, the coronation of King Charles III. And while Buckingham Palace is keeping quiet on most of the details, we are hearing a few things. It's been 70 years since the last coronation. Just like Queen Elizabeth's in 1953, this will be at London's Westminster Abbey and keep mostly with tradition.
It is, of course, primarily a religious service. There's no constitutional need for the coronation. Charles became king as soon as his mother died back in September.
King Charles, though, is expected to add his own touches, which include some new religious aspects.
It's very significant indeed. The last coronation of the late Queen in 1953 was almost entirely run by Anglican clergy, the male clergy of the Church of England.
Ian Bradley with the University of St. Andrews School of Divinity tells CBN News more Christian denominations will be included this time. And for the first time, Charles will include other faiths as well.
So one of the things that's happened recently is that the order of service was delayed. And we're pretty sure it was delayed because Charles wanted a group of representatives of other faiths to lead the prayers. But there's a rule in the Church of England, it's part of the Church's law, and it's backed up by Parliament's law, that to lead the liturgy in an Anglican church, you have to be a believing Anglican. So there was a conflict, and it looks like Charles lost.
Now, instead of leading prayers, Muslim, Hindu, Sikh, and Jewish leaders will present the king with 4 pieces of coronation regalia. Gavin Ashington once served as chaplain to the late Queen.
Can you tell us about her faith and how she viewed her role and how that might compare to King Charles?
Faith was very important to her, and we know this from her Christmas broadcasts. They increasingly were personal and very faithful, and although she was advised, she would have written them essentially herself.
He says no one's quite sure about King Charles's private beliefs.
Well, we've had one Christian Christmas broadcast, but he was brought up under the influence of Carl Gustav Jung. A man called Lawrence van der Post was his tutor. So he's much more committed to a more progressive agenda than Christianity is comfortable with. And I think one of the tensions we're going to see both in the coronation service and in his reign is the way in which he tries to balance his Christianity, being defender of the Protestant faith, with his sense that he needs to reflect a secular, progressive worldview that his subjects have adopted or are part of.
But Ashington says not knowing the monarch's personal beliefs is not necessarily a bad thing.
If you have a king or a queen, you don't necessarily want to know what their private views are, because they may then only represent one half of their kingdom instead of the other. It becomes polarizing like politics.
Thousands are expected to line the streets Saturday morning as King Charles and his wife, Queen Consort Camilla, make their way from Buckingham Palace to Westminster Abbey. The ceremony starts at 11 a.m. local time. That's 6 a.m. East Coast time. Jenna Browder, CBN News.
Well, you go back to the history of how did we get this title, Defender of the Faith. It's not unique to England. It was curious how that commentator said defender of the Protestant faith, because the Church of England split from the church in Rome, from the Catholic Church, and they created their own national religion. And for centuries, the only people who could ordain or crown a new king were Anglican ministers. You weren't allowed to be other Protestants. You could only be Anglican and do that. But the history goes all the way back to Charlemagne. And it was designed, it was the title, Defender of the Faith. I will defend the faith against the Muslims. He came to power after the Battle of Tours, which followed the sack of Burgundy, and it was all Muslim invasions coming out of Africa. They first took Spain, and then they tried to take all of Europe. And so Charlemagne said no, and he created the Roman Empire. And with that, he established himself as king, and I am now the defender of the faith. So as we see these things change over time, I think it's wonderful that Prince Charles, now King Charles, is going to say, I'm open to other Protestant faiths. But when you say, I want to be a defender of all faiths, well, is that taking it a road too far? We'll see. Sometimes the chair you sit in makes who you are. And my hope is, becoming king, he'll get a revelation.